Aloha, thank you all for tuning in to our Thursday Hanauma Talks edition. Today we'll be featuring Dr. Jared Underwood, for the Superintendent, Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. And he'll be talking to you guys about monitoring and managing seabirds on refuges in Hawaii and the Pacific, past, present, and future.
Thank you. I'm excited to be virtually here today to speak with you about monitoring and managing seabirds across refuges in Hawaii and the Pacific. This is something that I've worked on for a number of years, and I'm happy to share with you about today. So I'm going to start off by just kind of introducing to you a little bit more about the National Wildlife Refuge system that we have, and then talk a little bit about the monitoring that we do for seabirds on refuges in Hawaii and the Pacific, and conclude with a short section on some of the management project we've done to benefit seabirds in Hawaii and the Pacific. So first, National Wildlife Refuges are found across the United States. All told, they're one of the largest protected systems of lands and waters in the world, over 1 billion acres. And as you can see in this map, they're found in every state and most of the territories of, including Hawaii and American Samoa and Guam. So here's a map of the National Wildlife Refuges in Hawaii and the Pacific. And you can see in this map that there's these red outlines and the red dots are kind of the extent of the National Wildlife Refuges and monuments in the Pacific. And you can see there's a lot of ocean around them. And so we'll talk a little bit about why these areas are so important for seabirds, but it really has to do with the fact that a lot of these refuges are the only bit of land for hundreds or sometimes thousands of miles around. So the national monuments in the Pacific, of which Papahānaumokuākea is one, there's actually several others in the Pacific: the Marianas Trench National Monument, and the Pacific Islands Marine National Monument, and the Rose Atoll Marine National Monument. All are managed both as National Wildlife Refuges and as Marine National Monuments. So just kind of a close-up on Papahānaumokuākea, the one that I'm involved in managing. You can see in the left bottom corner here the extent of the protected area is roughly the size of half the United States, and includes many small islands and atolls that range north and west from the main Hawaiian Islands. And it is the largest protected area it was the largest protected in the world, and it still is the largest protected area in the United States. So the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands in particular have been important for a really long time. Here's a map of from 100 years ago, when the islands were set aside as a bird reserve. Now this slide shows a little bit of the history of Papahānaumokuākea, which is also paralleled in most of the other marine national monuments. But in the early 1900s, the U.S. Marines were sent to stop the halt of kind of seabird harvesting. In the early 1900s, both eggs and seabirds were being decimated, not just in the United States, but around the world, for both their meat and their feathers. And in 1909, Theodore Roosevelt created the Hawaiian Island Bird Reservation. So that was over 100 years ago. In 1940, it was Hawaiian Islands was designated also a National Wildlife Refuge. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was increasing levels of protection and identification of the area in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands as important for seabirds and also the coral reefs that surrounded them, their environment. Culminating in 2006, when George W. Bush created Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, and in 2016 when President Obama expanded that, making it the at that time, the largest protected area in the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the seabird populations, not just in Papahānaumokuākea, but across all of those marine national monuments and refuges that I showed you in the Pacific. So here's a picture from Laysan Island, one of the islands in Papahānaumokuākea, and you can see the density of nesting albatross 100 years ago. And this is kind of what it looks like now. There are still a lot of albatross that use these areas, and especially for the Laysan albatross and the black-footed albatross, this is the most important area in the world. But you can see there's probably a few less albatross now than there was 100 years ago. And again, that's a result of a culmination of a variety of threats that have faced albatross over the last 100 years. There are many other seabirds that use the Hawaii and the Pacific Islands refuges and monuments. And I will kind of introduce you to some of them as we go through this presentation. Here's kind of a snapshot of a variety of them. So the estimated number of breeding seabirds just in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands is close to 6 million. And that includes albatross, about a little over 1 million Laysan albatross, and about 100,000 black-footed albatross, a number of petrels and shearwaters, which are smaller birds that nest in burrows. We have the wedge-tailed shearwater, for example, here in the main Hawaiian Islands, nesting on the offshore islands, and sometimes also on the near the beaches in the main Hawaiian Islands. And we have tropic birds, the booby birds, terns, and Noddies. And I'll kind of show you some of these. But just in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands alone, 6 million birds are breeding. So here's a picture of a red-tailed tropic bird chick. So seabirds adapted to breeding on these islands that were predator-free. And so their nest is basically just laying an egg on the ground in most cases, besides the burrow nesting ones that actually dig a burrow. And then the boobies, the boobies and frigate birds, which like to make nests in some sort of structure, whether that's a tree or a shrub. Here we see some boobies nesting. The white ones are the adults, and the white fluffy ones are the chicks, and the brown ones are the juveniles. This is a frigate bird, Eva bird, called here in Hawaii, but the males use this red pouch to kind of show the females how attractive they are. Terns, these are sooty terns, which are, if you noticed in that chart I showed you, are among the most prolific. There's 1 million to 2 million of these in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Here's another booby chick. And then we also get some other birds less frequently, a variety of petrels and shearwaters that infrequently use the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. But these birds don't really have boundaries. They're flying across the ocean, and a storm or a weather event could bring them to an island, and they might land on that and use that, but they don't normally nest or breed in Hawaii and the Pacific. So just the significance of Papahānaumokuākea, it has the largest assemblage of tropical seabirds in the world. It is one of the largest continuous series of intact tropical seabird nesting communities, meaning that they are still primarily used by seabirds and have not been severely impacted by humans, or are not currently severely impacted by humans. Has 95% of the world's Laysan and black-footed albatrosses, and has significant colonies of Bonin and Tristram storm petrels, and again, the white terns and red-tailed tropic birds. So one of the things that we do in the refuges and monuments is to assess whether or not we're doing a good job of being stewards of these lands as we assess the populations of seabirds. Our assumption being that if seabirds are doing well, if seabird numbers are increasing, then we're doing positive things for them in the refuges. Now, again, that only is a small portion of their life and that they're spending actually on land. The majority of the time they're out at sea, and so there are other impacts to them, other threats that they face when they're out in the open ocean. But for any species to continue, they have to be able to breed, and they need a safe place to do that. And that's what these refuges and monuments offer. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a first kind of real assessment of seabird populations in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And since then, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state have monitored seabirds on some of the islands more closely. And specifically, we've focused on albatrosses and petrels and boobies and tropic birds. So we monitor in kind of two main fashions. The first is to do pelagic seabird surveys, where you're kind of running transects on a ship and you count birds and their prey, flying fish, as you're traveling along. From these transects that you run on the ship, you can get kind of a better understanding of density of birds across space of the ocean. So we also do direct monitoring of populations on the islands, and the level of effort that we have for monitoring seabird populations on the islands in the refuges is dependent on the number of people we have there and how long they're there. Until about 10 years ago, we had year-round camps on several islands within the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and we were able to monitor those the bird species on those islands fairly intensely. Now most of our islands, with the exception of Midway Atoll, have only seasonal or sometimes or other kind of infrequent visits. So as I'll describe in a moment, that makes monitoring for seabirds a bit of a challenge. So at the locations where we don't have year-round presence, basically we get a snapshot of presence, absence of what species are there, which is still important from a ability just to make sure that the birds are still there, but it doesn't really allow us to understand a population trend. At locations where we have a year-round staff presence, which currently across Hawaii and the Pacific is at Johnston Atoll and Palmyra Atoll and Midway Atoll, we're able to do more intensive monitoring for key species. We do mean incubation counts, which I'll describe in a minute, and we monitor reproductive success, like how is hatching, how is fledging, and then the breeding phenology, or when are birds on each of these islands and when are they breeding. And again, the level of effort on each of those places that we currently have people is dictated by the level of staff. So here's an example of why monitoring seabirds can be a challenge. Here we have a black noddy. So on the right, you'll see graphs from 3 different years, and they show kind of when birds, the numbers of birds that arrived and when they arrived and bred. So you can see in 1999, kind of throughout the year, there were several peaks where there was large numbers of birds and large numbers of birds breeding. In 2001, almost all the birds came in May and June. And then in 2002, there was far fewer birds than in 1999 or 2001, but, and they all came in mostly in January and February. So one challenge with tropical Pacific seabirds is that they're asynchronous breeders, meaning that they don't all breed at the same time. besides some of them like albatross, but like these Noddies here, they come at different times, and not the whole population comes to an island and breeds at the same time. They also are somewhat ephemeral, meaning that they might nest on one island one year and another island another year. And so just because you see it going from 1999, there was, 10,000 Noddies to 2002, there were only about 2,000 Noddies nested. That doesn't mean that 8,000 Noddies disappeared. It just means that they could be using a different island. They're not as tied to a specific place as they're tied to their food resources that shift around the ocean. And so they might end up at a different island for nesting because that's closer to where the food is. And then a challenge with, so if we were trying to conduct monitoring and we could only go for a couple months, if we said, oh, well, we're always going to go in, October, November, December, because that's when there's birds based in 1999. We show up in 2001 and 2002, we'd find nothing. And so we wouldn't have an accurate idea of what had happened to the Noddy population. And as you also see, the birds don't all, well, they're aseasonal, which means that they don't breed in a certain season. So it could be they breed in spring, it could be they breed in winter, and could be they could really breed any time of the year. So one way we get around this challenge, and is only possible when we have a year-round camp, is mean incubation counts. So we take a count of all active nests for each seabird of interest, and it's taken at the interval that corresponds to the incubation period for that species. So if birds lay their eggs and they're expected to hatch every 30 days, then, or 60 days, then at every 30 or 60 days, we would go back and count the number of nests again and note which one had eggs and which one had hatchlings and stuff like that. So year round, you would eventually get a picture of how many nests total, or minimum total number of nests that were on the island. And so that's how we got some of these data here. You can see these on these different graphs. Because we were doing it at those frequent intervals, we were able to capture when the Noddies themselves were actually nesting. So that's just one example of challenges with monitoring these seabirds. Now, not all the seabirds, as I mentioned, are as challenging to monitor. Albatross, this is albatross on Midway, are counted annually. Every nest is counted annually. And you can just walk right up to where the nest is, and they use a little spray paint to identify which nest they've counted, because you can see here you could easily get confused about if you'd counted a nest or not. So in December and January, we count all the nests on the island, and it's fairly easy. They're out in the open, they're large, easy to count, and these albatross, as compared to the Noddies, do come back every year to the same island. And they actually come back to the same little square, basically 10 or 15 foot square area that they nested in the year before. So, and they will do that for 50, 60 years in some cases. So this is makes them a little easier to monitor. But that's not the truth for most of the seabirds that are on these islands. Here's just another example of the complexity of monitoring these seabirds. You can see in this graph kind of when there are both eggs and chicks on an island. And for the different species, basically you can see that throughout the year, there's almost no time when there's not something nesting or with chicks on these islands in Hawaii and the tropical Pacific, or the central Pacific. So this can make both counting difficult, because it's not like it's a seasonal thing that you get a break. And it also can make management difficult, because there are almost always birds that you need to be considering when you're doing some sort of a management action on these islands. So here's just some more beautiful pictures of seabirds. I like to say this booby here has a face only a mother could love. Not the most attractive chick. Here's some more Noddies. A frigate bird chick. Now this graph, I'm sorry, it's very small. I'll try to just give you a general idea of it. So this kind of is a summary of all the monitoring we're doing across Hawaii and the Pacific. Shaded cells in this light gray identify areas where we know the species is breeding. And the red lettering denotes whether or not we're actually currently doing something on these islands. And then black lettering denotes where we've recently stopped monitoring in the last 10 years, monitoring for these seabirds. Now there's different things on here that we are, different levels of monitoring that we're doing. Presence absence, which is identified by a PA. Year-round, YP is the year-round population census, which is that mean incubation count that I described, where you're going out every 30 to 60 days or whatever the incubation period is and counting. And then IP is the infrequent population census. So some of these islands, like you'll see here on Jarvis. Can you see my arrow when I point it? Okay. Infrequent population census, we only get to these islands like Jarvis, Howland, and Baker once every couple years. So not only we're not going yearly to assess presence absence, but it might be 3 years or 5 years that we get there, only every 3 years or 5 years that we get there. So in the islands where we have presence, then we're also doing reproductive monitoring and breeding phenology. So you can see that for most of these islands, here's all the islands up here across the top and the species down the other axis here. Most of the islands, our current monitoring is mostly presence absence or infrequent monitoring. Like I mentioned, we do have people at Johnston, so you'll see some more kind of reproductive monitoring and breeding phenology on that island, as well as Palmyra and Midway, which I believe is this column, but I can't see because it's being blocked. But for the most part, we infrequently get to these islands and or maybe only for a week or two. And so that makes monitoring challenging. So we've been trying to come up with some additional methods that we could do. So when we do go to these islands, we will count nests. This is a tropic bird, a red-tailed tropic bird. You can see the red feather right here. Here's a frigate bird. So I mentioned they like to nest on structure. And in some of these islands, there's basically nothing beside, the tallest thing is maybe a foot tall, but they'll take advantage of that, even if it's just a foot tall shrub. Again, these islands, in the most part, are just covered with birds. So even just walking around causes them to get excited. Blue Noddies, another species here that are found on our refuges and monuments. And another booby chick here. So some of the data we can get from doing these surveys, especially when we are there on a more regular basis, is we can actually get the population trends. We don't get that though from these infrequent visits. All we can get is that presence absence or just that snapshot every couple of years of what's out there. But on the islands where we do have, or we have had longer term monitoring, we have seen that in general species have rebounded from probably their lows shortly after World War II. And that's because many of these islands, including Midway and French frigate shoals, were used during World War II as well as Palmyra and Johnston and Howland and Baker, and a lot of them were used as used by the military in the war in the Pacific. And so that did impact birds either directly through the numbers of people who were there, or indirectly because they brought invasive plants or predators to the islands. And over the past decades, we've been able to reverse that largely. So because we can't get to these places, one of the future ways, and current and future things that we're looking to do, is do more remote monitoring. And so on some of these islands over the past 5 years, we've set up remote sensing, both here cameras that are able to take pictures, and they're set to take pictures every 30 minutes and have a large SD card in there that can last for 3 or 4 years. And then we are trying to use computer algorithms to go through the 30,000 images per camera when we get them back and see what kind of birds we're using it. But this is a way we hope that we can get at least at a little bit better at the phenology, or what's there during what time of the year. We won't actually get numbers, but we can increase our understanding of presence and absence and phenology. And over down here is another thing that we are pairing with the cameras, which are acoustic recorders, which record the songs of birds or the sounds of birds. But then again, we can use a computer to kind of go through. And while it doesn't give us a density of birds, it does, again, give us that presence, absence. And also we can use it to detect species that are maybe a little bit rare, like nocturnal species we might not see, or burrowing species that we might not see, or infrequent visitors. So these are able to be out there 24/7, like I said, every 30 minutes recording information, and we can leave them out there for years, as opposed to having a person out there. We're also, as satellite imagery has improved, we're using satellite images of some of the islands to count the larger species like albatross. So I think that's probably the future for monitoring, and as opposed to having these field camps. And the reason one of the main reasons we stopped having field camps on some of these remote islands was our increase in storms intensity and frequency in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and in the Pacific. And so that has led us to consider, a little bit the safety of these year-round camps. Because if there's a problem, we can't, they're 5 or 6 days away by boat. It's not like we can immediately address the situation. So now I'm going to move on to the management actions section of my talk. So one of the roles of refuges and as refuge and monument managers is to try to enhance and protect the species that we are caretakers of. And so I'm going to talk about some projects that we've done in the past or are currently doing, and some projects that we're doing or will be doing in the near future. So our management actions mostly relate to threats. One of the main threats that we have on these remote islands is invasive plants, So when an invasive plant gets to one of these islands, they can very quickly cover the island and alter significantly the habitat. I'll just give you one, although there's several examples here, I'm going to give you one example from Midway and Curie in Pearl and Hermes. The golden crown beard, or verbicina, is a sunflower-like plant that grows about 6 feet tall. And here's a picture of it when it's small. But it grows to be about 6 feet tall, and it blocks all the wind. And so when there's all these albatross chicks on the ground nesting, and there's a 6 foot tall plant, it actually causes them, it blocks the wind and it causes them to overheat and die. And so on Midway and on Curie, and to a lesser extent on Pearl and Hermes, which is where this picture is from, we have been able to control the verbicina and remove it, and that has greatly benefited the seabirds as far as having more habitat and decreasing mortality. So there are other species of concern, the sandbur or sancris, and then ironwood, which are a tree, which we have in the main Hawaiian Islands, but they alter the soil chemistry and the soil dynamic, as well as create different habitat than what most of the seabirds are used to. Since a lot of them like to nest on the ground, if the whole island's covered in trees, that's not beneficial to them. So we have conducted invasive plant control, like I mentioned, on Midway, Curie, and Pearl and Hermes, as well as on a variety of other islands for sancris and for ironwood on Midway. And when we've done these, we've definitely seen improvements to the habitat, and the birds also respond. Another challenge is invasive invertebrates, so insects. We have ants, and probably the three of highest concern are ants and grasshoppers, and then scale insects. The ants and the scale insects also have a relationship where the ants will farm the scale insects. The scale insects are these white white things you see on the plant here. We also see those here in the main Hawaiian Islands. They drink the sap out of the plant and basically are like vampires sucking the life out of it. And that has killed many native plants on our islands. Grasshoppers, like the plagues in Africa, they will just eat everything. And when there's a grasshopper explosion, they've denuded endangered and native plants on some of our remote islands like Nihoa. And mosquitoes are actually not found on many of the islands, but they are found on Midway, and they, like on the main Hawaiian Islands, are a vector for disease. You'll see this poor albatross chick down here in the bottom has these like lumps on its beak and around its eye. That's avian pox. We also have that in the main Hawaiian Islands, and that's one of the reasons why our native forest birds are not found below the mosquito level, because of this mosquito-borne diseases, which don't necessarily kill the seabirds as readily as they do the forest birds, but they do impact their ability to survive. So I'm going to give you an example of one project we're currently doing on Johnston Island. So Johnston remained under military control until about 10 or 15 years ago. And so you can see in this picture, there's still a lot of that legacy of roads and runways on the island. In the mid-2000s, we discovered, this was also the testing site for a lot of our nuclear and chemical weapons, and so it's not safe to eat things there. So in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, we discovered on one of these infrequent trips to the island that there was this ant, called the crazy ant, which it forms these incredibly dense swarms. And sorry, I don't have a better picture of it, but actually I think this is one here, right here. Forms these incredibly dense swarms, and they will actually swarm the seabird. They were swarming the seabirds while they were nesting and squirting acid out of their abdomens into the eyes of the seabirds and irritating them and causing them to abandon their nest. So we decided to attempt an eradication of the yellow crazy ant on Johnston Atoll, and I've been working on that for the last 10 years. Initially, we send out groups of volunteers to go out and both search and bait, search for the ants and bait them. Here are two volunteers from several years ago, and they were using these squirt guns to deliver a mix of poison, ant poison mixed with Karo syrup and cat food. Ants prefer, depending on their life cycle, either sugars or protein. And so that was how that combination came up with. On Johnston, this is where they live, inside of this bunker. And this is their garden. They cannot plant anything in the ground because of the legacy of nuclear and chemical weapons, but so all their gardening is above ground. And I don't know if you can make this out clearly, but that cement bunker is a fallout shelter for if there was a nuclear accident while they're on the island. So the walls of it are like 8 feet thick. It's not going anywhere. So it provides a good place for them to hang out. And here's just an example when I went of all the cat food that we brought out to the island to, again, to make that bait, that mix of bait. So This project has been incredibly successful. We are getting close to being able to say they've been eradicated. There hasn't been any ants observed in over a year. And we still have people out there volunteering and searching for them and still doing, again, seabird monitoring and baiting for the ants. But we're hopeful that we were successful in this project. And it was a lot of effort over the last decade to eradicate that. Midway has a unique legacy of having buildings that were built during World War II. And on Midway, we noticed that some of the albatross chicks were suffering from lead poisoning due to the paint chips from these buildings. So in the last 5 to 10 years, we have worked to encapsulate all those buildings so that there would not be lead available to the chicks, and that has drastically improved the health of those chicks that were nesting close to the buildings. And continue to work on the avian pox mosquito issue and try to reduce any sources of water for the mosquitoes. Again, because many of these islands were used by the military for a number of years, there are still hidden surprises on some of them. Contaminants, PCBs, lead, DDT, things like that. There are also sometimes we uncover mystery barrels, which we don't know what they are. And all of these could have a potential effect on seabirds, both on their nesting or directly through poisoning. DDT is one of those chemicals that kind of started the revolution against using pesticides because it was impacting bird nesting, specifically seabirds and raptors. And then we have marine debris, which includes plastics and discarded or lost fishing gear. Albatross in particular still succumb to the longline fishery. So as I mentioned earlier, these birds live for 50, 60, 70 years. And so taking out even just one bird can significantly impact the population, because that could be a pair of albatross. Albatross generally mate for life, and a pair has a chick every year or two. And so over 50, 60, 70 years, that can be a lot of chicks that would have been added to the population if the adult had survived. So this remains a problem. And like I mentioned, marine debris and plastic. Here's a chick that did not necessarily die because of the plastic in its stomach, but you can see when the albatross go out and collect food and bring it back and feed it to their chicks, they collect all sorts of debris that is floating around the ocean, and in some cases that can impact the chicks. But fortunately, most of the chicks are able to regurgitate the plastics that they consume or that their parents give them before they depart from the island, and they, similar to an owl pellet, right before they leave, they regurgitate a bolus, it's called, and that contains all the undigestible things, which used to be mostly squid beaks, and now includes also almost all boluses have some sorts of plastic in them. The next challenge, and probably one that's has the potential to be the greatest challenge, is that of changing climates and changing sea levels. As you can see from this picture here on the top, most of these islands in the Hawaii and the Pacific are very low. The max elevation might be 10 feet, it might be 20 feet, or maybe 30 or 40 feet at the most. But as sea levels rise, that has the potential to impact, and we've already started to see on the edges of some of these islands, the albatross or birds that are nesting right on the edges of the island are continuously, their nests are failing. And like I said, albatross in particular come back to the exact same place. So if your place no longer exists, that creates a challenge. But it's not just the sea level rising, it's also increased storm frequency. and intensity. In 2018, we had a Category 5 hurricane go through the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and it completely eroded an island in French Frigate Shoals. The island has partially come back now, but it still is too low to provide habitat for seabirds or sea turtles that nested there. And you know, as the climate changes, that also allows for shifts in the prey. Maybe they'll be further away from the island, and it makes their nests less successful because the birds can't get out to the prey and get back to their chicks before either they die or their chicks die. So one of the projects that we've been working on for about the last 5 years is an assisted migration project. So helping the birds, in some cases, where there are already populations on the main Hawaiian Islands or close by, helping to, in this example here, bring albatross to a refuge on the north shore of Oahu that either came from Midway Atoll or French Frigate Shoals, or from other places where they were endangered. So trying to create a new colony on a high island, our hope is that in the future then, that these places can provide a refuge for seabirds. And on this project, we've done in cooperation with Pacific Rim Conservation, we've translocated 4 different seabird species to James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge on the north shore of Oahu. And we use social attraction, that's what these speakers are here, to try to draw in adults and also to attract back the young that fledged there. So seabirds, they imprint on the area they were born and are likely to return to that area. So we're hoping that over the next 5 years, we'll see, like I said, this project's been going on for a couple years, but albatross don't actually return to breed until they're 5, 6, 7 years old. So over the next 5 years, we hope to see the return of these birds to this, and this will become a viable new colony that's on a high island. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is invasive predators. So around the world, invasive predators, especially rodents and cats, have had large impacts on seabirds. As I mentioned, most of them are not adapted to dealing with predators. You can walk right up to an albatross and you could, eat it if you were a cat or something like that very easily. So as we remove rodents and cats from these islands, we see species rebound, and we also see species that we didn't that were extirpated or were not using the island anymore come back. So on the left, you'll see a picture of a bone-in petrel, which prior to World War II, there was a large colony breeding on Midway, estimated at 250,000 pairs. During World War II, mice and rats were introduced to to Midway, and so the population of bone-in petrels plummeted to 2,000 to 5,000 pairs. Rats were eradicated in the early to mid 90s, and at that point the population started to rebound, and they were able to increase to 70,000 by 1999, to 130,000 by 2008, and to 329,000 pairs by 2019. So we can see a positive impact of these invasive predator control projects. So the last project I'm going to talk about is one that we hope to do next year, the Midway Seabird Protection Project, also known as the Mouse Eradication Project. This is the last project, or this will take care of the last invasive rodent population in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, the house mouse. So the project's going to be taking place at Midway Atoll. Midway Atoll is made up of 3 islands: Sand Island, Eastern Island, and Spit Island. There are not mice on Eastern or Spit. They're just mice on Sand Island, so that's where the project will take place. As I mentioned earlier, rats and mice were introduced during World War II, and during the mid-90s, rats were eradicated from all 3 islands. And however, house mice, which are smaller, still persist on Sand Island. In 2015, we started noticing albatross with these wounds on their heads, and some were being just wounded and others were actually dying. And so we put up cameras to see what was going on, and we found, as you can see in these 2 bottom pictures, mice were actually crawling up onto the albatross at night and biting them and drinking their blood, and then they were either causing the albatross to abandon their nests or to, like I said, physically die. So we decided that this would be the best time to conduct an eradication project. And so eradication is unlike control. The goal is to actually get rid of every single individual. And so there are several keys to success in this kind of a project. One is that every mouse has to have a chance to eat the bait. So you have to get enough bait into every little place that, into every mouse's home range, so that every mouse actually will choose to eat the bait. And that's the second part. The bait has to be palatable. It has to be something they want to eat. So we've done a lot of research over the last 5 years into what mice eat on Midway, what their genetics are, so that if we conduct this mouse eradication, once we conduct this mouse eradication, if we do find a mouse, we can identify whether it was a mouse that was already on Midway or whether it's from a new introduction. And then, of course, trials with the bait to see if they were, to make sure that what we're proposing to use they would eat. So there's a lot of complexity with a project on Midway. There's lots of non-target species. Non-target species are species we don't want to kill. There are several endangered species like the Laysan duck, a number of seabirds and shorebirds. There's also the endangered Hawaiian monk seal and the endangered or threatened green sea turtle. And then there's a host of challenges with the fact that there are 50 people that live on this island, as well as a lot of abandoned buildings and an active airfield. So Henderson Airfield on Midway Atoll is a FAA airport that serves as an emergency stopover spot for all of the flights that cross to Asia. And if that was not there, they would have to fly up closer to Alaska. So in 2021 is when we will be conducting this eradication. And we'll be using a rodenticide known as Birdificum, and we're going to cover the whole island with a helicopter. And it uses this spreader here. It kind of looks like a seed spreader or a fertilizer spreader that you might use on your grass. It kind of spins out pellets at a set rate, and we monitor to make sure that is the adequate rate, again, to make sure that every mouse has an opportunity to eat the poison. And then we're going to be baiting, we'll be baiting in all of these buildings here and hand baiting in areas around the runway where we cannot bait. We can't actually bait over the runway. So here's just kind of a map of what it looks like. All these little lines here, each of the transect, the helicopter is going to fly. To limit the introduction into the marine environment, we're using a directional spreader along the edge of the island. And then around, we don't bait over the runway here. And we'll hand bait in areas around water, the fresh water that is that's on the island. So in 2021, we hope that the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument will be rodent free. And again, that will greatly benefit the seabirds. So that's the conclusion of my presentation today. If you have questions, my email and phone number are here. My email is jared_underwood@fws.gov. And my phone number is 808-208-2095. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks for your time.